The Soviet Union, once a superpower spanning 11 time zones and encompassing 15 republics, was a symbol of communist strength and influence for nearly 70 years. From the icy expanse of Siberia to the bustling streets of Moscow, this colossal state shaped global politics, economics, and culture. Founded in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union emerged as a formidable force. Under leaders like Lenin and Stalin, it transformed into an industrial and military giant. The world watched as the Soviet Union competed with the United States in the Cold War, landing the first man in space and engaging in an arms race that kept nations on edge. However, beneath the surface, cracks were forming. By the 1980s, the strain was showing. Economic stagnation, political repression, and growing discontent among its citizens created a volatile mix. Reform efforts, while ambitious, only accelerated the unraveling. In this video, we will explore the 10 key reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed, from economic struggles and political reforms to rising nationalism and international pressures. One of the primary reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union was its economic stagnation. Despite being a superpower, the Soviet economy struggled with deep-seated inefficiencies and a lack of innovation. In the early years, the Soviet Union saw a rapid industrialization under leaders like Joseph Stalin and Nikita Khrushchev. The focus was on heavy industry, military production, and collective agriculture. However, by the 1970s and 1980s, this model began to falter. The centralized planning system, which was effective for rapid industrialization, became a hindrance to sustainable economic growth. The Soviet economic system was characterized by central planning, where government planners made all decisions about production and distribution. This system led to significant inefficiencies and waste. Factories produced goods without considering demand, resulting in shortages of consumer products and surpluses of unwanted items. The inefficiencies of the planned economy were evident in daily life. Basic consumer goods were often scarce, leading to long lines and frustration among citizens. The emphasis on quantity over quality resulted in inferior products that were difficult to sell domestically or internationally. One of the most striking examples of economic inefficiency was the agricultural sector. Despite having vast arable land, the Soviet Union struggled to produce enough food, leading to dependence on grain imports from countries like the United States and Canada. The Soviet Union also lagged behind the West in technological innovation. The rigid bureaucracy stifled creativity and discouraged risk-taking, essential components for technological advancement. While the Soviet Union made significant strides in areas like space exploration and military technology, it failed to translate these successes into broader technological and economic benefits. The lack of incentives for innovation and entrepreneurship hindered progress in critical sectors such as consumer electronics, computing, and pharmaceuticals. As living standards fell and economic hardships increased, many citizens began to question the legitimacy of the Soviet system. Economic performance is closely tied to political stability. When people face continuous shortages and declining living standards, their support for the government weakens. In the Soviet Union, this economic discontent became a breeding ground for political unrest and demands for change. In an effort to revitalize the faltering Soviet economy, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced a series of reforms known as Perestroika, meaning restructuring. These reforms aimed to modernize the economy by introducing elements of market economics, but they ultimately contributed to the destabilization of the Soviet Union. Perestroika was initiated in the mid-1980s as a bold attempt to address the inefficiencies of the Soviet economic system. Gorbachev sought to decentralize economic control, reduce the role of the state in business, and encourage private enterprise and foreign investment. Gorbachev recognized that the Soviet economy was in dire need of reform. Perestroika was his solution to inject dynamism and innovation into an otherwise stagnant system. However, the transition from a centrally planned economy to a more market-oriented one was fraught with challenges. The implementation of Perestroika faced significant obstacles. The Soviet bureaucracy, deeply entrenched in its ways, resisted the changes. Managers and workers, unaccustomed to market mechanisms, found it difficult to adapt to the new economic realities. Perestroika created a hybrid system where state-owned enterprises were expected to operate under market conditions without the necessary market infrastructure. This led to confusion, inefficiency, and economic disruption, exacerbating rather than alleviating economic problems. The introduction of market elements led to economic disarray. Prices of goods fluctuated wildly, and shortages became even more acute. While perestroika was intended to improve the economy, it had the opposite effect in the short term. Many people faced greater hardships as the transition created economic turmoil, leading to widespread discontent and protests. Perestroika's failure to deliver immediate economic improvements weakened Gorbachev's political position and deepened divisions within the Communist Party. The reforms not only disrupted the economy, but also shook the political foundations of the Soviet Union. It highlighted the systemic issues within the Soviet Union, including the inefficiencies of its political structure. The inability to effectively implement and manage these economic reforms revealed deep flaws in the governance of the state. The economic and political turmoil caused by perestroika accelerated the decline of the Soviet Union. By attempting to reform the system without addressing its fundamental issues, perestroika hastened the collapse of the Soviet state. Instead of revitalizing the economy, it contributed to the instability that led to the Soviet Union's dissolution. Alongside economic reforms, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost, a policy of political openness, aiming to increase transparency and freedom of expression. While intended to strengthen the Soviet Union, glasnost instead unleashed a wave of criticism and demands for change that contributed to its collapse. Glasnost, meaning openness, was initiated by Gorbachev in the mid-1980s to foster greater transparency in government and encourage public discussion. It allowed for the release of previously censored information and lifted restrictions on the media. Gorbachev hoped that by promoting openness, he could build public support for his reforms and reduce the pervasive corruption and inefficiency within the government. However, glasnost had unintended consequences that spiraled out of control. Under glasnost, the Soviet media began to expose widespread government corruption, economic mismanagement, and historical injustices. These revelations shattered the public's faith in the Communist Party and its leadership. Glasnost lifted the veil on decades of systemic issues that had been hidden from the public. The exposure of these failures led to a surge in public disillusionment and anger, undermining the legitimacy of the government. The newfound freedom of expression allowed political dissent to flourish. Dissidents, previously silenced or imprisoned, now had a platform to voice their criticisms. Public protests and calls for political reform became increasingly common. Glasnost empowered the people to demand more significant political changes. It created an environment where criticism of the government was not only tolerated but encouraged, leading to a rapid escalation of political unrest. Glasnost also exacerbated ethnic tensions and nationalist movements within the diverse Soviet Union. Various ethnic groups and republics began to push for greater autonomy and independence, challenging the unity of the Soviet state. Nationalist movements that had been suppressed for decades found new life under glasnost. The policy allowed these groups to organize and express their demands openly, contributing to the fragmentation of the Soviet Union. The Communist Party, once the unchallenged authority, found itself increasingly divided and weakened. As criticism mounted, the party's control over the state and society eroded, leading to internal conflicts and a loss of coherence. The internal strife within the Communist Party reflected the broader societal upheaval. Glasnost, intended to strengthen the state, instead exposed and exacerbated its weaknesses, accelerating the collapse of the Soviet system. Nationalism and ethnic tensions. The Soviet Union was a vast and diverse empire, home to over 100 different ethnic groups. Under the surface of unity, however, simmering ethnic tensions and rising nationalism began to challenge the very fabric of the Soviet state. The Soviet Union was composed of 15 republics and numerous autonomous regions, each with its unique ethnic and cultural identity. While the Soviet government promoted a policy of socialist internationalism, ethnic tensions and nationalist sentiments persisted. The Soviet policy of promoting local cultures within a framework of centralized control worked for a time, but it also preserved and even amplified ethnic identities. This created an underlying tension that would later erupt. During the era of glasnost and perestroika, nationalist movements gained momentum across the Soviet Union. Nationalist movements were particularly strong in the Baltic states, which had been independent nations before their annexation by the Soviet Union in 1940. Glasnost allowed these suppressed sentiments to come to the fore, fueling demands for sovereignty. In addition to nationalist movements, ethnic tensions led to violent clashes in several regions. The Caucasus, home to a complex mosaic of ethnic groups, became a hotspot for conflict, resulting in bloodshed and displacement. Ethnic groups like the Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and Georgians had historical grievances and territorial disputes that erupted into open conflict as the Soviet Union weakened. The Soviet government's ability to control these rising ethnic tensions diminished significantly. Local leaders began to assert more autonomy, and in some cases declared independence, further fragmenting the Soviet Union. The central government's loss of control over its republics and regions highlighted the weakening grip of the Soviet state. As local authorities gained power, the unity of the Soviet Union was increasingly called into question. The tide of nationalism reached its peak with key declarations of independence. The Baltic states led the way, followed by Ukraine, Belarus, and others. Each declaration marked a significant step toward the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Each republic's move toward independence was a blow to the Soviet Union's cohesion. By 1991, the momentum was irreversible, leading to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev's political reforms, aimed at revitalizing the Soviet Union, inadvertently weakened the Communist Party's control and contributed to the collapse of the state. These reforms created a power vacuum and unleashed forces that the party could not contain. Recognizing the need for change, Gorbachev introduced a series of political reforms to democratize the Soviet system. These reforms included the establishment of the Congress of People's Deputies and competitive elections to reduce the Communist Party's monopoly on power. Gorbachev's reforms were groundbreaking. For the first time, genuine political competition was introduced into the Soviet system, allowing for more open debate in the election of non-communist candidates. In 1989, the Soviet Union held its first competitive elections since the early days of the revolution. This marked a significant shift in Soviet politics, as citizens could now choose from a variety of candidates, including those not affiliated with the Communist Party. These elections were a double-edged sword. While they brought a sense of democratic renewal, they also exposed deep divisions within the society and the party, weakening the Communist Party's grip on power. The introduction of political reforms led to significant fragmentation within the Communist Party. Factions emerged, with some members supporting Gorbachev's changes and others staunchly opposing them. This internal strife eroded the party's cohesion and authority. The Communist Party was no longer a unified force. The reforms created a situation where the party's influence diminished and its control over the Soviet Union weakened, making it difficult to govern effectively. The weakening of the Communist Party gave rise to alternative political movements. Dissidents, reformers, and nationalists seized the opportunity to organize and campaign for their causes, further challenging the party's dominance. Political pluralism began to take root, and with it came a surge of new ideas and demands for change. These movements played a crucial role in shaping the political landscape, leading to increased calls for independence and reform. The internal divisions within the Communist Party came to a head in August 1991 when hardline members attempted a coup to oust Gorbachev and reverse his reforms. The coup failed, but it significantly weakened Gorbachev's position and accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union. The coup attempt was a desperate move by hardliners to regain control, but it backfired spectacularly. It showcased the deep fractures within the party and galvanized public support for more radical changes. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 marked the beginning of a decade-long conflict that drained the Soviet Union's resources, morale, and international standing. This costly and unpopular war significantly contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In December 1979, under the pretext of supporting a friendly government, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The aim was to prop up the struggling communist regime and secure Soviet influence in the region during the Cold War. The decision to invade Afghanistan was driven by strategic concerns. The Soviet leadership wanted to maintain a buffer state on their southern border and prevent the spread of Western influence. The war in Afghanistan quickly turned into a quagmire. The rugged terrain, coupled with fierce resistance from Afghan fighters, made it difficult for the Soviet military to achieve a decisive victory. The conflict drained the Soviet economy, costing a lot of money and leading to the loss of thousands of lives. The economic burden of the Afghan war was immense. It diverted resources from vital domestic needs and exacerbated existing economic problems. The prolonged conflict strained the Soviet budget and contributed to the overall economic decline. The war had a devastating impact on Soviet soldiers, many of whom were ill-prepared for the harsh conditions and guerrilla warfare they faced. Morale plummeted as the conflict dragged on, and reports of casualties and atrocities further eroded public support for the war. The Afghan war became increasingly unpopular at home. The sight of coffins returning from Afghanistan and the stories of suffering and hardship contributed to a growing sense of disillusionment with the Soviet government and its policies. The invasion also had significant international repercussions. It led to widespread condemnation and increased tensions between the Soviet Union and the West. The United States, along with other countries, provided substantial support to the Afghan resistance, further complicating the Soviet military effort. The international community's reaction to the Soviet invasion was swift and strong. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and increased military aid to the Afghan Mujahideen intensified the pressure on the Soviet Union. By 1989, the Soviet Union, under Gorbachev's leadership, decided to withdraw its forces from Afghanistan. The decision was a tacit admission of failure and marked a significant blow to Soviet prestige and influence. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was a turning point. It underscored the limitations of Soviet military power and highlighted the severe costs of the war. The damage to the Soviet Union's international reputation and internal stability was profound. The economic decline in Eastern Europe during the 1980s significantly weakened the Soviet Union's influence and control over its satellite states. As these economies faltered, the ripple effects contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. Throughout the 1980s, Eastern European economies struggled with inefficiency, lack of innovation, and heavy debt burdens. These centrally planned economies, much like the Soviet Union, were unable to compete with the more dynamic and technologically advanced economies of the West. Eastern European countries faced significant economic challenges. High levels of debt, inefficient industries, and lack of consumer goods created widespread dissatisfaction and unrest. The economic problems in these countries reflected the broader issues within the Soviet bloc. As economic conditions worsened, public discontent grew. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, led by Lech Walesa, became a powerful force for change. Similar movements in East Germany, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia called for both economic and political reforms. The economic decline galvanized opposition movements across Eastern Europe. People were no longer willing to tolerate the shortages and lack of freedoms imposed by their governments. This widespread discontent was a critical factor in the weakening of Soviet control. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of perestroika and glasnost had a profound impact on Eastern Europe. While intended to reform and stabilize, these policies also encouraged Eastern European nations to seek greater autonomy and pursue their own paths of reform. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the collapse of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Peaceful revolutions swept across the region, toppling communist regimes and paving the way for democratic governments. The Soviet Union's inability to sustain its control over Eastern Europe was a clear sign of its weakening power. The loss of these satellite states not only diminished its geopolitical influence, but also undermined its internal stability. The Chernobyl disaster, which occurred on April 26, 1986, was one of the worst nuclear accidents in history. This catastrophic event had profound social, political, and economic impacts on the Soviet Union, contributing to its eventual collapse. In the early hours of April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded during a late-night safety test gone wrong. The explosion released a massive amount of radioactive particles into the atmosphere. The explosion at Chernobyl was the result of a flawed reactor design combined with serious mistakes made by the plant operators. The immediate response was heroic but insufficient to contain the disaster's impact. The Soviet government's initial response to the disaster was marked by secrecy and denial. Officials attempted to cover up the severity of the explosion, delaying the evacuation and failing to inform the public about the true scale of the radiation release. The government's mishandling of the disaster and its attempt to suppress information significantly damaged public trust. When the truth eventually came out, it revealed the deep flaws in the Soviet system's ability to manage crises. The health and environmental consequences of the Chernobyl disaster were devastating. Thousands of people were exposed to high levels of radiation, leading to acute radiation sickness, long-term health issues, and an increase in cancer rates. The contamination affected large areas of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, displacing entire communities and rendering vast tracts of land uninhabitable. The environmental and health impacts of Chernobyl are still being felt today. The economic cost of the Chernobyl disaster was enormous. The Soviet government had to allocate vast resources to containment, cleanup, and compensation efforts, straining an already faltering economy and diverting funds from other critical areas. The handling of the Chernobyl disaster eroded the Soviet government's legitimacy both domestically and internationally. The exposure of the cover-up and the subsequent public outcry weakened the credibility of Soviet leadership. Chernobyl was a turning point in the public's perception of the Soviet regime. The disaster and the government's response became symbols of the systemic issues plaguing the Soviet Union, fueling demands for political change. The intense international pressures of the Cold War, particularly the arms race with the United States, placed immense economic and political strain on the Soviet Union. This relentless competition was a significant factor in its eventual collapse. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union was a central aspect of the Cold War. Both superpowers invested heavily in developing and stockpiling nuclear weapons and advanced military technology, leading to a massive buildup of arsenals. The Soviet Union devoted a significant portion of its GDP to military spending. This competition required substantial financial resources, which strained the Soviet economy and diverted funds from other crucial sectors. Military spending consumed a large share of the Soviet budget. The need to match U.S. advancements in weapons and technology meant that resources were often redirected from essential areas such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure development. The focus on military expenditure led to significant economic imbalances. The Soviet economy struggled to sustain such high levels of defense spending while also trying to meet the needs of its civilian population. This imbalance contributed to economic stagnation. While the Soviet Union achieved notable successes in areas like space exploration and missile technology, it lagged behind the West in consumer technology and other critical innovations. The focus on military advancements often came at the expense of broader technological development. The technological lag in civilian sectors was a significant issue. International diplomatic pressures also played a crucial role. The U.S. pursued a strategy of economic and psychological pressure, exemplified by President Reagan's aggressive stance and the Strategic Defense Initiative, which aimed to develop a missile defense system. The Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, was a turning point. It forced the Soviet Union to consider additional expensive military investments to counter a potential U.S. advantage, increasing the strain on an already burdened economy. The Soviet Union's global influence began to wane as it faced increasing criticism and resistance to its policies. The combination of military overreach and declining influence undermined the Soviet Union's status as a superpower. The loss of control over Eastern Europe and the withdrawal from Afghanistan were clear indicators of this decline. On August 19, 1991, a group of hardline Communist Party members and senior officials, opposed to Gorbachev's reforms, launched a coup. They declared a state of emergency, placing Gorbachev under house arrest and deploying tanks in Moscow. The coup leaders, known as the State Committee on the State of Emergency, aimed to roll back the reforms of glasnost and perestroika, restore central control, and prevent the further disintegration of the Soviet Union. However, their actions had the opposite effect. Public resistance to the coup was immediate and widespread. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, emerged as a key figure in opposing the coup. In a dramatic moment, Yeltsin stood on a tank outside the Russian White House and called for a general strike. Yeltsin's defiance galvanized the public and the military. His call for resistance drew thousands of citizens to the streets, where they built barricades and confronted the coup forces. Yeltsin's actions were instrumental in the failure of the coup. Within 3 days, the coup collapsed. Key military units defected to the side of the protesters, and the coup leaders were arrested. Gorbachev was released from house arrest and returned to Moscow, but the political landscape had fundamentally changed. The failure of the coup significantly weakened the Communist Party and accelerated the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's authority was undermined, and Yeltsin emerged as the dominant political figure. Yeltsin's rise marked the end of the Soviet era. His leadership during the coup and subsequent actions ensured the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the emergence of the Russian Federation as an independent state. Following the coup, Boris Yeltsin moved quickly to consolidate power. He banned the Communist Party in Russia, took control of state assets, and declared Russia's independence from the Soviet Union. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a monumental event that reshaped the global political landscape. It marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter in history. From economic stagnation and failed reforms to rising nationalism and the catastrophic Chernobyl disaster, the reasons for the Soviet Union's collapse were numerous and interlinked. Each factor played a critical role in unraveling one of the 20th century's superpowers. The dissolution of the Soviet Union had profound impacts on the world. It led to the independence of 15 republics, transformed global political dynamics, and ended the Cold War. The ripple effects of these changes are still felt today. The end of the Soviet Union brought about significant geopolitical shifts. It paved the way for the expansion of NATO, the European Union's growth, and the emergence of new economic and political alliances. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you found this video insightful, please like and subscribe.